Thank you for coming to SciCon again. Today we'll be covering social psychology, which is definitely quite different from a lot of other approaches, both in their approach and their focus.
Definitely.
Pretty much all the approaches we've covered so far are focused on the individual and how the individual functions, but social psychology is more looking at how individuals as a unit function with other individuals.
Yeah, and how groups can affect individuals and affect other groups. It's a lot more general.
Yeah, rather than looking at the inner workings of the individual, it looks at how an individual works with other individuals.
Definitely. So to start, we will be revisiting our old friends, the Greek greats.
So that's where everything starts.
Yeah, as with all things.
I wonder if this is a very Eurocentric approach.
What do you mean?
As in, like, we talk about the Greek greats because we're European.
Oh!
Despite our recent Brexit. And if we were from, like, China, would we be quoting a different old philosopher?
That's really interesting.
So if you have any input on that, guys, let us know if there's a American or Asian or Australasian equivalent to this sort of...
Yeah, if they started differently in different countries. That's a really interesting one, actually. That would be a fun thing to look into.
I don't know how that would fit into social psychology.
Yeah.
Maybe how the context which we learn information affects the information we learn.
Well, you've also got different kinds of societies. So you've got individualistic societies like you have here in England.
So it's unsurprising that a lot of our theories are individualistic.
Yeah, and then in a lot of Asian countries they're more collectivist. So I imagine they do have different foundations if they study social psychology in a different way.
Yeah.
Because they approach society in a completely different, with a totally different attitude.
I mean, we assume that we share knowledge equally, but looking back on most of what we've been taught, it comes from a lot of it comes from Germany and well, it's mainland Europe and England, and then later on in the Americas.
Yeah.
But we've definitely been taught it's only recent research that we sort of see any non-Western influences.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's very true. So yeah, if you've got any non-European founders, let us know. That'd be really fun. But yeah, so taking the individual-centered approach, Aristotle believed that humans were naturally sociable, and that this sociability was necessary for survival, to live together.
So just a very basic instinctual drive to seek out another person.
Yeah.
And that he looked at it as just the individual seeking out the other person.
And that ties into a lot of evolutionary theory as well, because obviously chimps and apes and other species quite closely related to us are very social animals. They live in troops, they groom each other to form close bonds. So it's probably evolutionary that we require contact with other people.
Chimps quite nicely lead us on to Plato's approach, which was more of a socio-centred approach or society-centred approach. So in the concept of chimps, he'd argue that because the hierarchy is in place, certain chimps behave in certain ways depending on their place in the hierarchy. And then to humans, society is there to sort of control people in the sense that it allocates roles to individuals so that the society as a whole can function. So he sort of took a top-down approach looking at how society influenced people. That was Plato, whereas Aristotle took a bottom-up approach about how an individual would seek out to join the society.
Yeah.
So I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive, they're just two different
ways of looking at it, different perspectives. Hegel, who was around between 1770 and 1831, introduced the idea that society has inevitable links with the development of the social mind. This led to the idea of the group mind, which is a key concept in social psychology, also known as Volcker psychology.
Volcker psychology emerged from a lot of Hegel's work. It focused on the collective mind and emphasised how personality was shaped through cultural and community influences, such as language, as language is both a product of the community, because they dictate the language that you use, but it's also an expression of the individual because they decide what words they choose to express themselves. Vocal psychology was sort of a prerequisite to social psychology before it got the name that it's got now.
Gergen, in 1973, stated that if the general principles of human behaviour could be established, it might be possible to reduce social conflict, to do away with the problems of mental illness, and to create social conditions of maximal benefit to members of society, hoped.
So this is sort of the driving principle between why you study social psychology, why you're interested in how groups interact, because you want to get rid of things like prejudice. And Gergen really sort of described this as the sort of 18th century optimism that people had about what vocal psychology or social psychology could achieve. And it was based on the sort of success that natural sciences had at the time, in physics and maths, and taking leaps to understand the universe and then applying that to like new technologies that benefited human society. These sort of theorists thought that if they could understand the workings of the human mind, that they'd be able to use that to their advantage in solving a lot of societal problems.
Yeah, so society was almost the technology, and they were trying to use social psychology to figure out the bugs and glitches.
Yeah.
That's quite cool.
So
yeah,
Gergen, in his paper, is somewhat criticising social psychology, in that he's saying it had all these grand intentions and that it was filled with optimism, but ultimately it wasn't a natural science in that what it observed and what it measured was specific to that time frame. So he argued that it was a historical inquiry rather than natural science. So it deals with facts that are largely non-repeatable and that fluctuate markedly over time. So if you're looking at prejudice, for example, the prejudice that you study now might not be the same prejudice that exists in 20 years' time, and you can't say that social psychology got rid of that. It's just that it's only observing what's going on at the time.
Yeah.
And an example of this is one of the earliest sort of famous classic studies in social psychology by LaPiere in 1934. You may have heard of it. It's where he travelled around America with a Chinese couple, because at the time there was quite a lot of prejudice against Chinese people, and he found that all of the establishments that he took them to, like hotels and restaurants, accepted the three of them in with no problem, apart from one which refused service. And so you could quite easily see Gergen's argument here about how applicable is this research to modern day society, like the same prejudice in America don't exist. But the thing that makes social psychology more of a science is that it's looking for the mechanisms that underpin this, that can be applied to sort of different contextual situations. So LaPiere, 6 months after his little road trip, he sent out questionnaires to all the establishments, and out of the 128 that replied, 91 to 92% of them said that they wouldn't let Chinese into their restaurant. And so what LaPiere uncovered there was that there's a huge gap between what people report their beliefs are and then what their actual behaviour is. So even if this prejudice doesn't exist anymore or isn't as prevalent anymore, and you couldn't repeat this research now, you can still repeat the finding that there's a discrepancy between your belief and behaviour, and that has been repeated time and time and time again.
It is quite difficult to pinpoint the first social psychology experiment, but one key early one was conducted in 1898 by triplets, who experimented with how the performance of cyclists and school children was affected by the presence of others. I think the main problem with early social psychology experiments is just the fact that because we have always lived in communities, everyone's a social psychologist. Everyone's always looking at other people's behaviour. Philosophers were trying to work out how to make the perfect society, but they were also looking at how parents interact and things like that, and that goes way, 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 way back.
So, because humans are inherently social, most of psychology is inherently social psychology.
Yeah.
Although not all psychologists would appreciate it. Social psychology is sometimes quite distant from the rest of psychology because it is seen as slightly less scientific. But I think the key thing is if you look at the sort of mechanism underlying the finding rather than focusing on the finding itself, then that's where it sort of becomes most useful. So going back to triplet study, school children today are not the same as school children back in the 1800s, but you know that they're still going to be affected by the presence of others.
Yeah, it just...
That's the key.
Yeah, definitely. And the mechanisms that underlie how that effect happens rather than what that effect is what we're looking at. Because, as you say, it's inevitably going to change. People change, societies change, but the mechanisms that rule the behaviour don't.